All right, good. Oh, I have to fix that. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure, even through the electronic media of a webinar, to be with everyone tonight. I'm Chris Hamilton. I'm the founder of Hamilton Education. For more than 25 years, I've helped students apply to selective universities, and I've seen a lot. Look at these gray hairs. I've seen a lot of changes, and my wife gets pretty frustrated when I'm watching something on the news or reading something online, and I see that people are getting something exactly wrong about applying to college or about a trend that's popular on TikTok about college. So I realized a lot of what drives me crazy, a lot of what is crazy right now, is also an opportunity, an extraordinary opportunity. All the things that I hear that are just dead wrong um, struck me a while back. This is exactly what I should be sharing with Hamilton education families, because there's a window of opportunity where when the larger population figures out the real situation in college admissions, it'll be even more competitive than it is now, which is hard to imagine. But for the time being, there are some things, some pretty common sense things that you can do that can give you extraordinary advantages. So I've titled this College Admissions is Crazy Right Now, but this craziness offers a window of opportunity. And you're going to have to kind of believe that things are crazy when the New York Times has an essay titled "This is Peak College Admissions Insanity." Now, to be fair, this piece, although it's very culturally significant, using the word insanity to describe the last year or two of college admissions, this is from a New York Times point of view. So if you read the piece, which I highly recommend, you'll find that what's insane to the New York Times is that a student who was sure she would get into Duke early decision did not get into Duke. I don't want to, commit a spoiler here, but she ended up going to Dartmouth, where she had legacy. So again, this is from the point of view of the New York Times. The craziness, I would argue, which is often the case, is exponential out here on the West Coast in California. So here's what I mean when I say college craziness. So until very recently, this is not something I would have ever seen. Um, Student number one, 4.4, 1590, ISEF Grand Award, amazing accomplishments. Student number two did not take an SAT, has no activities. If you want to know which one got into UC San Diego, uh, you can see where this is going. It was student number two and not student number one. For most of us, that seems a little bit crazy. Student number one, before we cry for her, got into MIT. She's studying computer science at MIT. UC Riverside did not accept student one for computer science as a major. So when I say things are crazy, this is partly what I mean. Here's another instance of craziness. In 2016, 119 Westview High School students applied to Berkeley. 44% were admitted. The admissions rate for students from Westview who applied to Berkeley in 2021, I'm giving you a couple choices. The answer, as you might imagine, is E, 6.7%. That is an admissions rate less than 1/6 of what it was before. When some counselors and some pundits talked about how test optional would make it easier for students to apply, would remove barriers, I was one of the grumpy observers that argued the other way. It's going to get more difficult for students to get in. Ivy Leagues in particular, of course, nearly every top tier university, they value selectivity. Selectivity means how many you reject. Much of the craziness that we've seen, acceptance rates plummeting down to single digits, has to do with the fact that the Ivies removed traditional barriers that were largely described with an old-fashioned word, merit, and their selectivity, the number that they reject, has increased. So you can see over the last 20 years, um, literally almost 3 times harder to get into Stanford or Harvard. If you look at the acceptance rates, this is part of the craziness. Um, Harvard and Yale pretty much cut in half. Some schools like Northeastern went from 34% to 8% acceptance rates. Um, um, this is crazy, creating a lot of uncertainty. If students who would traditionally be getting into Harvard and Stanford do not get in, if students who traditionally get into Berkeley, people are frustrated. But I want to suggest that a lot of this craziness, a lot of the insanity presents essentially an extraordinary opportunity. I'm going to talk about SAT and ACT, how you can take advantage of this confusion, issues of identity, which is a polite term for matters of ethnicity and your racial ethnic background, majors, some misinformation about majors, and really misinformed so-called wisdom about college essays. I'm going to talk about all 4 of these things. First one, testing. Test optional was never really an option. I'm borrowing a phrase from an Ivy League admissions director who I spoke with in 2020, who basically said, I think most people understand that, unless you fit into a very special category, test optional isn't really an option. He was mistaken. People didn't understand that. And many, many strong applicants who didn't submit scores in the last couple of years didn't understand that colleges really meant we would strongly prefer scores. We want scores. I encourage everyone to take the SAT and or the ACT and understand what category of applicant you're in. If you're an athlete being recruited to an Ivy League school, there's one score that might do it. If you are in an underrepresented or overrepresented category, you might have yet another score. I'm happy to talk privately about what do those numbers look like. Harvard contributed to the insanity and confusion by telling kids in very simple language, people who do not submit standardized test scores will not be disadvantaged in their application process. That turned out to be absolutely false. Pomona College says it's a personal choice. I want you to consider, though, a client in Los Angeles saw this on the Pomona website, spoke to a soccer coach. Her daughter was being recruited at Pomona and schools in the consortium. And the soccer coach said, when he learned the daughter had a 1,500 on the SAT, the soccer coach said, well, yeah, she should submit scores, but first she should retake the SAT. They're going to want to see a minimum of a 1,530. You could look at this website all day and you will not find anywhere, actually, we have a minimum of a 1,530 for certain types of students. That is not the message. No wonder people got confused. Again, this confusion is something you can use to your advantage. We have long, since 2021, been looking at the data and showing people actually submitting scores is a huge advantage for college admissions. People who applied above the 25th percentile on an SAT or ACT were getting in at twice the rate. Even people who were in the bottom quarter were 25% more likely to get in than people who didn't submit scores. Almost everywhere you look in 2021, 2022, 2023, the data said, no, 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 you should submit scores. Every single one of our students, and we have dozens who got into top schools, including Ivies, they submitted scores. And then last year, we started to see MIT bravely stepping up, saying, not only are we going back to requiring the SAT and ACT, but you should know we can't build the diverse class we'd like to build without these scores. A few brave journalists are talking about the role of the SAT and ACT, confirming really what a UC study confirmed many years ago, that the SAT and ACT are tremendously fair and vital to building a diverse class of first years. This brave person from Dartmouth, Dartmouth's president, Sean Blaylock, said they're going back to requiring the SAT, ACT, and admitted that the SAT and ACT optional policy hurt diversity at Dartmouth. Students, unfortunately, really took all the colleges at their word when they said, submit or don't submit. It's a personal choice. Why would they do that? Because college websites said as much. She said there were people who held back scores in the 1300s or 1400s who had other things to contribute, and we would have accepted them if they had only sent us their scores. This is echoed by the presidents of Brown and Harvard and Yale. What's puzzling to me and what is a wonderful opportunity for you is that there are still voices, talking heads on TikTok telling you you don't need to take the SAT or ACT. That's marvelous. That's wonderful. I should pay those people to keep saying that. Life itself is not a zero-sum game. Your friends can all thrive and do well, have happy relationships, great jobs, success in life. It doesn't take anything away from your chances to be successful, but you can't all get into Harvard or MIT or Stanford. There's a very limited number of spots, typically about 1,650 available in a year. Um, if there are people who are very talented, very strong candidates, but they simply don't realize that they should be submitting scores, and you do realize that, you have a comparative advantage. Purdue, I spoke with a Purdue rep just a few weeks ago who was a little grumpy. She didn't like that Purdue was changing their language from test optional to test preferred. She wanted, she said, for Purdue to just say, everyone should submit scores. But Purdue wants more selectivity. They want more applicants. If they say test preferred, they'll get maybe 10,000 naive students who apply to STEM majors at Purdue without submitting scores. They will not get in, but they will help Purdue's selectivity. I asked her, what percentage of students, when you were test optional, what percentage of students who got in submitted scores? Answer 97%. 97% of students accepted to Purdue submitted scores. I'm going to talk about the second factor. It's the trickiest, identity in admissions. Identity, again, means essentially where are your relatives from? Where's your family from? What is your ethnic identity? A lot of people are saying out loud, they're saying on TikTok, now that the Supreme Court of the United States, SCOTUS, has decided that affirmative action is against the law. Students for Fair Admission won their case against Harvard. Now these identity issues will not be a factor in admission. That is not the case. I want you to consider some of the essay questions that Duke introduced in light of the Supreme Court case. They are almost entirely asking about community, about your orientation, about identity. Northwestern's essays are largely about community and identity. If colleges didn't want to know this, they would not be asking. I want to focus on the UCs for a moment and this issue of identity, because the University of California has visited these issues of admitting people based on identity much earlier than the rest of the country. This is making me a little reminiscent, a little sentimental. This is a admission profile for UC San Diego from 2017. This is what we might call transparent admissions. You can see how many applied, how many were admitted, what the rate was, and you can see with GPA bands, if you were very strong, you were almost 66% likely to get in. If you were a little weaker, you might be only 19% likely to get in. You can see that if you have strong scores, you could be, again, more than 60% likely to get in. You can see that for UCLA, even if you were very impressive, you're still only about 30% likely to get in. You can also see that UCLA is a very popular place to apply. And you could see Berkeley is also a school that would be described as a reach. And maybe for some candidates, San Diego would be a target. I want you to keep in mind, though, in the last couple of years, my students who get into MIT are often rejected, not only from Berkeley and UCLA, but Riverside, San Diego. Now, other students of mine get into all of the UCs. I want to explain why I think the UCs have tackled issues of identity um, in a way that's important for people applying to understand. The UCs, the University of California, stopped publishing any kind of data about who gets in this robust fashion. They stopped publishing this sort of data in 2018. Um, this is the last year uh, that we saw anything like this. Why did they pivot to a less transparent and more opaque admissions process? I am pretty comfortable, pretty familiar with the UC system. From 1995 to early 2000s, I taught English at UCLA. In the LA Times coverage, I'm in some of these photographs. I helped organize civil disobedience to defeat some propositions that I thought might harm students and harm the immigrant groups that I worked with in the UC system. A voter proposition called 209, which sought to end racial preferences in the UC system. It prevailed, and the UCs, starting in 1998, had to build a new system to admit people, looking at a number of factors, but not giving what were then called points based on race and identity. And so the UCs introduced in 2006 what they called comprehensive review. It meant that they would look at many different categories, and there's a heavy emphasis on seeing leadership and hardship and other elements. The SAT was very important, ACT were important, but not so important that they're the only things that mattered. Kids with lower scores would get in if they had good grades and maybe had some context to explain their scores or other factors. This is the golden period of UC admissions. And I would point out, as recently as 2019, 10 of the top 15 most diverse public universities are within the UC or Cal State system. Um, you need to know, though, the UC system at the Regents level initiated a 2-year study of the SAT, ACT, and they began advocating for Prop 16, which was an effort to reverse Prop 209. They wanted to once again use ethnicity, identity, and race as admissions factors. You need to know the UCs felt they had a problem. There was a group of Californians that they felt were overrepresented. That group includes Asian Americans. Neither one of the UC's efforts worked as planned. The study of the SAT and ACT, I have a copy of it here. The study discovered that the test optional plan would not be a good plan, that the SAT and ACT were excellent predictors and were very fair. The study recommended that the UCs keep using the SAT and ACT, but it was the decision of the regents, 23-0 vote, overturning the faculty, 51-0 vote to keep the test. The regents voted to get rid of it. And that explains much of the craziness in admissions in the UC. There are a couple ways you can use this to your advantage. The number one way, of course, is to simply be aware of it. I want you to be aware. It is important to write good, strong applications, to have strong essays for the UCs, but it's equally important for you to understand it may be that no human will read them in the sense that we use the word read traditionally. I want you to consider a little bit of math. There are a minimum of about 3,000 words on a typical UC app, including essays and activities and transcript and other elements. There could be as many as 4,000 or 5,000 words. The average college-educated person reads 240 words per minute. If you're reading quickly, you should get through about 4.6 applications in an hour. If you're reading them as an outside UC reader, UC Irvine paid just 2 years ago $2 an app. That means if you read them quickly, you would be making $9.20 an hour. If you were paid that in any fast food restaurant, your manager would go to jail. It's a violation of California's labor policies. I want you to consider there are full-time UC admissions readers, as many as 12 or 15, who also read applications. The UCs are very, very adamant that every UC application is evaluated by two outside readers. I think that's true, but when we say evaluated, most of the UC admissions readers that I've spoken to confess that they read around 10 to 15 applications in an hour. But if that's the pace, they're not reading them. They're absolutely skimming them. They are not really digging into who you are, which would explain some of the arbitrariness. The other arbitrariness in admissions, when I say arbitrary, I mean randomness. I mean, true story, students getting into Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, uh, MIT, not getting into Irvine, Davis, Santa Barbara, not getting into Cal Poly SLO, not getting into San Jose State, not getting into Berkeley, not getting into UCLA. Don't cry. Student that I'm referencing is at Stanford. But for most of my clients, Stanford is not their backup if they didn't get into UC Irvine. The UC outside readers cannot be reading the essays unless they're okay with making about $9 an hour. And the full-time UC readers, there's 12 to 15 typically. If it's UCLA, they're supposed to read 150,000 applications. That math also suggests it can't be done. That explains why you need to understand strategically in this craziness that the UCs no longer evaluate students in the way they once did. You need to build that in to your college plan. You need to know the UCs could work out fantastically well, but I have someone this year who got into Harvard and Stanford, had to decide between the two of them, did not get into Santa Barbara or Davis or Berkeley. If you are curious about this, and I recommend you dig into it, you might find some interesting things. I have. You can go to the common data set for the UCs and put in your school, put in someone else's school, put in the UC campus, put in the year, and you can get data going back almost 30 years. What percentage of students are accepted from what high schools? Here's some interesting numbers I found just last week. King Chavez is a public charter school downtown in San Diego. It has on a typical day a 40% absentee rate. That means 40% of the students are not in school. The acceptance rate last year to UC San Diego for King Chavez students was 57%. Hoover is in El Cajon. Their acceptance rate last year was 39.6% to UC San Diego. And Del Norte, which is a blue ribbon school, it's ranked third in all of San Diego, and it's ranked pretty highly in US News national evaluation of high schools. Del Norte had an 11% acceptance rate. Again, I want to make sure people know this. You've got to first see these things with clear eyes. The UCs have essentially reinvented the admissions process, aware that it's illegal to directly use identity to make sure there are, in this case, fewer Asian American students. So they've used indirect methods. They have almost certainly built hard quotas for certain high schools. This is the only real practical explanation for why acceptance rates for Westview and Del Norte were here. Now they're here. Acceptance rates for schools that were very low are now up here. Unweighted GPA has become probably the single most important factor for UC admissions. I want you to look at this carefully. Unweighted GPA of a median unweighted GPA for UCLA last year was 4.0. That means a single B could be a serious problem. Keep in mind, some of the high schools that have the highest acceptance rates to the UCs now have policies that we call equitable grading. Essentially, everyone gets an A. It may not be the case that everyone is learning to their full potential, but no one is getting Bs. In other high schools, students who are perfect on the SAT or ACT still may get a B or two, depending on who is teaching math, who is teaching chemistry, who taught ninth grade English. A question that someone asked who couldn't make the webinar is, for applying to UCs, is it better to attend an academically easier high school to have a higher GPA? In the past, I would have said, well, not necessarily, because you're also not going to do as well on APs and standardized tests because you're getting A's without putting in the same work and effort. I would have to say now, if you were really, really aiming for the UCs, yes, you would want to, more than anything, make sure you don't have any Bs. I would argue looking at one number, unweighted GPA above all others, is the opposite of holistic admission. But again, I want people to see this reality clearly so you can build a plan. And the plan would be to apply to some colleges outside of the UC system. Atlantic writer Caitlin Flanagan, she's a liberal, she's a Democrat. I highly recommend you seek out this article published in 2001. It's called, very bluntly, "The University of California is Lying to Us. Does getting right with contemporary concepts of anti-racism mean reviving one of the state's most shameful traditions?" If you're wondering, what is this shameful tradition? She's speaking about anti-Asian hate. This is a newspaper headline about the death of Vincent Chin. He was murdered in Detroit because someone in Detroit thought that he was Japanese and represented the auto industry that was displacing American auto workers. We might think that's ancient history. That's 40, 50 years ago. The headline on the right, Indiana University student stabbed in alleged racially motivated attack on bus. That's from last year. You don't have to look very far to find headlines about violence directed at Asian Americans, and you don't have to look very far to find the rationale for the UCs wanting to constrict the number of Asian American students in top UCs. This quote is from the person who used to be the superintendent of the San Diego Union School District. "We have an influx of Asians from China," she explains, "and the people who are able to make that journey are wealthy. A large influx of Chinese families moving in sight unseen into our homes, into the community, and that requires money." So the argument is apparently it's okay to discriminate against Asian Americans who are applying to the U system because they are all millionaires. As many people participating in this webinar tonight are aware, the opposite is true. The UCs did extensive research and discovered if they, in place of racial identity, used income, they would get too many Asian American students. It turns out this story that all Asian Americans who are attending school, all Asians who immigrate to the United States are wealthy, is far from the truth. In fact, most of my clients who came from somewhere on the continent of Asia came with about $100. You need to know the history of colleges using these factors of identity is not pretty, but it is one that isn't over either. These are two books I highly recommend. The Chosen is by Berkeley sociologist Jerome Karabel. Nicholas Lemon wrote The Big Test. It's a history of what he's calling the American meritocracy. I'll give you one little piece of this. In case you are thinking, Mr. Hamilton, there could never be anything like a quota that's instituted in the UC system. I mean, that's not something that would be done. I want to draw your attention to this bottom paragraph of this rather famous letter. This person is talking about having lunch with someone associated with Princeton admissions, and they're talking about why there were no African Americans admitted to Princeton. This person goes on to ask how many Jews were at Princeton during that period. Mr. Hibbins said about 200. I said, how many were there last year? He said about 200. I asked how many there were the year before that. He said about 200. I said, how does that happen? He said he didn't know. It just happened. Mrs. Hibben was outraged and said, Jack Hibben, I don't know how you can sit there and lie to this young man. You know very well that you and Dean Eisenhart get together every year and fix the quota. Um, I want you to consider it is vital. It is important that you understand on a scale of what we might call identity and merit. Both are in quotes. They're not easy to define. Many colleges are heavily, heavily fixated on identity, but all colleges care about diversity and making sure that there's representation that is reasonable. Most colleges care about what we might call merit, your individual effort, skills, and abilities, but not all colleges weigh these the same. The UCs in the last couple of years at UC San Diego have admitted nearly 1,000 students into engineering and computer science majors who have not had the second year of algebra. How do I know this? I know faculty, they're my clients at UC San Diego. From one standpoint, this is marvelous. There's 1,000 kids who really wouldn't have had a chance into UC San Diego in those majors. I also would point out, though, there are 1,000 kids who probably would have thrived and hit the ground running because they've already had algebra 3, 4, pre-calculus, calculus. They are ready to go. Um, the math department at UC San Diego has to simply invent almost 1,000 spaces for pre-calculus for students who are going to be studying engineering. You should know that magazines like Forbes are talking about new Ivies. I just want to draw your attention to some of them. University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, University of Maryland, College Park, Michigan, Ann Arbor. People that are from the Midwest think you're just discovering that Michigan is essentially an Ivy League school. It's often kind of considered the public Ivy of the Midwest. University of Wisconsin-Madison. In these schools in particular, engineering and computer science programs are in the top 10 in the United States, and many have acceptance rates 3, 4, 5%. Here's the thing. In the last year or two, our students are getting into these new Ivies in majors that have 3 or 4% acceptance rates. Our students are getting in at acceptance rates of around 80%. How can you go from a 3% chance to an 80% chance? Sending these colleges what they want, which are traditional measures of merit, SAT, ACT scores, leadership. I want to talk a little bit about majors since this drives me crazy. Here's a message from UC Irvine. If you ask UC Irvine what majors are impacted, this is literally what you get. Good news, UCI doesn't have any impacted majors. And then it goes on to tell us the majors that are the most highly selected. They are, of course, the impacted majors. Why would UC Irvine not simply honestly reveal which majors are impacted? Because all of the UCs and all top tier colleges want more applications. If they were to be honest, students might think twice about applying to nursing, computer science, business administration. There's a fancy word I don't hear as much, disingenuous. It's a very polite word for dishonest. Here are some other statistics for UCLA showing various majors or various colleges that contain various majors. 11% for the College of Letters and Science, but for engineering at UCLA, 4.9%. You need to know, if anyone is telling you major doesn't matter, your applications don't have to take account of your major, that really depends. Are you in an impacted major in the College of Engineering or nursing or architecture, TV, or are you in an open major? That distinction is vitally important. It's something we talk about with every family I meet. Take a look at University of Washington, Seattle. The U.S. non-resident, that means you are a U.S. citizen, but you don't live in Washington. The acceptance rate for the majors in computer science and engineering are 3%. Um, Major is tremendously important. Knowing how that can change your chances and knowing whether you can switch into an impacted major later or not is a hugely important factor. It's one reason why we work very closely with families, students, to understand all of these sort of intricate layers, because some colleges, like Ivy's, you can apply to a major that would be highly sought after at other colleges and switch into it, like computer science at a later date. Other places like U Washington or UC's, you need to apply to that impacted major from the start. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about essays, why they're important. I hear tremendously misinformed things about essays. Um, yes, essays are important. Most of the people dispensing advice about college essays are people who got into some Ivy League school themselves a few years ago, and they think they know what works. They know what worked for them. I've seen more than 1,000 acceptances to Ivy Plus campuses, and I've seen them from students who are in overrepresented categories. Um, I know what great Ivy League essays look like for the kinds of students that we work with. And I would want you to consider even students who had great success often aren't fully aware of what worked in their essay. I found this article in Business Insider. This is a sweet kid. He's got a really cute dog. He is from Virginia, I think. He says he was accepted to Yale, and here's everything I included. I want you to look at the bullet points. He got into Yale after submitting a successful college application. Okay, that seems redundant. He included his SAT score, good for him, and high GPA in the application. Of course. Here's where I think he's misreading his own application. Along with an essay about my culture. I read his essay. You can actually dig into this story and read a big chunk of his essay. I'm sorry, he did not write about his culture. He wrote about something much more important. In his essay, he wrote about the fact that he was poor. You need to know an Ivy League admissions director told me in the last couple of years, if you're in an overrepresented category, if your culture isn't underrepresented, don't write about your culture. This kid thinks he wrote about his culture. I read his essay. He wrote about being in a marginalized group. He didn't even fully realize that that was what Yale was interested in. Um, I, for years, have been reading college essay guides like this one by Fisk. It contains examples of supposed real college essays that work. Um, I've had many students come to me with these essays saying, I want to write an essay like this one. This kid got into Princeton and he wrote about being in a play once. Quite literally, I was able to take a look at the student's name, Google him, and discover, yes, he wrote an essay about being in a play once. He didn't want to. He was kind of forced to try something new. He didn't hate it. It's important to try new things. This is, by the way, the plot of Green Eggs and Ham. The student, when I dug in just a little bit, I discovered was in the Princeton Football Hall of Fame. He did not get into Princeton because of an essay that he wrote. He got into Princeton because of football recruitment. Um, there's an essay called the Costco essay that some people say, this girl got into 5 Ivies. This must be an awesome essay. It's kind of clever and funny. Um, there are other people, and I am one of them, who look at the essay and know this would not work for my students. This girl had another factor that was very influential. I hope you'll consider, in my experience, there are two basic college stories. Number one is something happened to me. If you lost one of your parents or a sibling, um, if you are homeless, if a military jet crashed and destroyed your home, something happened to you. But for most of my students, nothing dramatic happened to them. It may be in your life getting a B feels like a terrible tragedy. Um, Parents being divorced, a grandparent who you love and care about is ill. These are not significant things to college admissions readers. If nothing happened to you, your college essay has to be how you happened to something. I made this chart years ago um, for a student named William, who showed me an essay inspired by a collection of essays uh, in a book. The essay was about how he met an old man in Mexico, and the old man's life was very sad. And I, on a post-it, drew this little graphic and said, William, you're writing an essay that's 80% this experience, this emotional experience, how you felt meeting this old man who was very sad. Why would that get you into Stanford? Isn't it true that you actually created some machine learning technology that taught computers to read prostate cancer slides on a Gleason scale? You won second in the International Science and Engineering Fair. They sent your skinny butt to Switzerland to visit the Large Hadron Collider at CERN. When you were there, scientists got excited about your project, connected you with a startup at Johns Hopkins. Isn't it true that you're a C-level executive in a startup and you have equity shares in the company? And he said, yeah, but that's in my resume. It's not the kind of thing you're supposed to write about. I begged him to simply tell Harvard, Stanford, UPenn, M&T what he did and a little bit of who he is and why he did it. He got into all of those schools. Um, in this craziness, in this confusion about how kids get into college, um, in 2020, in the height of this craziness, 25% of the kids in the counties of Southern California who got into Harvard were our students at Hamilton. I hope you'll believe me when I say if you've done something that has impact, um, and you can bring some insight into why we should care, that is the story that you should tell. Almost 95% of my students who get into Ivy Plus universities, their essays are going to show two things: impact and insight. If you did something amazing, it doesn't speak for itself. It's just a line in a resume. They need to know um, what that looks like. What is the story? And you need to endow it with insight. We're we're very good at helping people find those things in eighth, ninth, and 10th grade that might build impact. And we're very good at working with kids around the world, helping them understand how to turn that into a story that endows it with insight. In the last few years, we've worked with kids in Dubai. We've worked with kids in India. We've worked with kids in China. We work with kids on the East Coast. We work with kids in the Midwest. I've worked with kids in Brazil. Um, we we know that your story is just as important as a score. And if you're not going to fit into the category of something happened to you, your story had better be about how you happened to something. You want to make sure you understand the admissions reader's perspective. Um, you need to know that if you're certain you want to be a scientist or an engineer or computer science professional, um, those are impacted majors that lead to careers that pay about 2 to 3 times what a typical college graduate would make. I can assure you, no one who studied those things is working in a college admissions office reading 130 applications minimum a day. Um, the people who are reading these essays are humanities majors. One of the advantages that I have been able to offer my students and families over the years is that I lived and breathed that environment at UCLA. I taught humanities at a major top tier American university. These are my people. This is my crowd. This is my tribe. I know them. I don't always agree with them, but you need to know um, if you're trying to tell people how hard you worked, how much effort you put in, you need to understand Um, the people who are reading your essays are reading from a perspective that may not value that in the same way your family does. I'll read you just a tiny little bit of a review, a very positive review of a book called The Tyranny of Merit. This philosopher asks, the reviewer says, why exactly anyone should be rewarded for having the sheer luck to be intelligent or able to work hard. If your essay is trying to show how smart you are or how hard you work, I want you to consider there's a large chunk of academics, of humanities folks who think that doesn't matter. I help students navigate this craziness by helping them understand the eyes that are looking at you, the ears that are hearing the words that you say. That point of view is equally valuable compared to the contributions we make, making sure that students do well on standardized tests. The number one thing I would want to stress tonight is you want to make sure you're not in that group that thinks the SAT and ACT are optional. In almost every data set we can look at, colleges want those tests. You're in a very special group indeed if you're going to be admitted without submitting these scores in this present moment. But you should also know what kinds of stories colleges are looking for. I'm very proud that we help students who are amazing in many ways help shape and shift their story so that it's giving an Ivy League, Ivy level reader what they want. I've tried to be very fast and efficient and leave some time for questions. I'm gonna go into my, can I get questions through chat? Winnie, because normally they would come to me directly, but let me just see if any questions appear. And I will do my best if anyone has questions that you want to submit either to me in email or you want to submit questions in any way, shape, or form. Normally, I have a bunch of questions that come to me, but I normally am hosting through my Zoom account. I'm hosting through the info account. Let me see what I have. I am Chris Hamilton. I'm the founder of Hamilton Education. Someone is asking, should we choose a school that's not competitive? That's a really tough question, and someone already submitted a similar question that I tried to address. If the UCs are your goal, if the UCs are your dream, I would say this: if you're at a school that is really good by traditional measures, very high academic performance index, very high on a US News ranking, everyone says this is a great school, but almost everyone gets 6 or 7 Bs. Even 2 or 3 of those Bs could be a problem for UC admission. So I would say certain schools in Poway Unified or San Diego, for instance, are highly respected, but it's not that hard to get almost all A's. Other schools, I'm very reluctant to name names. I have students who are double perfect, perfect SAT, perfect ACT. They still got a B in a math class. That is a very competitive school indeed. Someone's asking if it's true that the SAT score should only be submitted if it's at least 50th percentile for that college. Even though I think that in some way conforms with common sense, I mean, if it's not going to be flattering and helpful, why send it? The data says even submitting a score that's below the 25th percentile is more likely, 25% more likely, and that's back in the early data sets. I think it's even more pronounced. I would put it this way. If you think, well, my score is not exactly what they want, so I will submit nothing, you are essentially taking the Fifth Amendment. You are being asked a question. Can we see some kind of objective measure of your basic skills in reading, writing, and math? And you are saying, I'd prefer not to answer. The evidence strongly suggests that it's almost always a good idea to submit scores, even if they're not in that middle 50th percentile for the college. I know that may sound a little bit crazy, but the data strongly suggests that that is the case. And if we think about it, if you're in college and your girlfriend says, people are saying that you were flirting with my roommate while I was out of town, um, a good answer would be no, that's not remotely true. A not very good answer would be maybe, I'm sorry. I don't think it would be a better answer to say, I refuse to speak to this question. I'm not even going to answer it. That's a little bit how not sending scores sounds. Yes, we do offer online SAT, ACT tutoring. We're very happy that we've had some extraordinary alumni of our program who we trained in traditional classes. They are, in some cases, at Stanford Law School now saying, hey, I need a summer job. I taught for you in-person classes. Can we do some tutoring? So we have an extraordinary group of people in addition to our regular SAT, ACT teachers. Yeah, someone is saying colleges are flat out lying to us. That is why I wanted to show people that Princeton letter from the 1970s. Universities are not truthful in terms of how they're evaluating people. It's a long-standing practice. I don't know what else to say. Um, um, UC Irvine says none of their majors are impacted. Good news. I mean, I don't know what to call that other than not the truth. Okay, how are the GPA requirements for non-UCs, like public Ivies? Want to make sure people know, I think GPA requirement is a bit of a misleading, even dangerous term. There are some good universities in the United States, top tier or in a particular major in the top 10, that do have requirements. It's very rare though. By requirement, I mean you hit a certain score, you hit a certain GPA, you're very, very likely to get in, almost guaranteed. That's how I would understand a requirement. In actual fact, I would say GPA requirements for non-UCs, the difference is for these public Ivies, they will heavily weight a weighted GPA. These public Ivies, especially in STEM majors or engineering in particular, they will look at a student that got 4 or 5 Bs, but has a really good score and a very high weighted GPA and be very impressed with that. The UCs tend to look at the unweighted GPA in the last couple of years because unweighted GPA favors high schools that have traditionally been underrepresented in UC admissions. I would say a 4.1, 4.2 is a very impressive GPA as a weighted GPA for many of the public Ivies. And for UCLA, it's not an impressive GPA. I don't think students should take easy courses. Someone is asking about that. I think they should take as hard a set of courses as they can handle, but not harder than they can handle. I think it's tragic, ironic, but the UCs and many other colleges had a more holistic admission system before 2020. It's now one that is designed to include certain students, but not include others. And they do that by focusing on Bs. We do help high school juniors with summer plans. We help people understand which programs are very, very meaningful, which ones are impressive, which ones are unimpressive, which ones are kind of paying your way in and your student will be, we hope, amused but not gain much. A 1530 is an excellent score for the SAT. Someone is asking. There might be 7 or 8 colleges where I'd say it might be worth taking it again if you could do a little bit better. What are those colleges? You probably know: Harvard, Yale, Princeton, MIT, especially for math. MIT really wants to see perfect math scores. A 1530 is not only a good SAT score, it is in the top 1%. It's such a good score. Many of these public Ivies would award a massive merit scholarship for someone with a 1530. I didn't even talk about that. I probably should have. We're trying to add up the offered merit scholarships this year. It seems to be pretty close to about $25 million. That's my best estimate. Some students, just individual students, have more than $500,000 in offered merit aid. Almost all of it comes from schools that value that tremendously value SAT and ACT. Why do they value them so much? Because their data, just as the Ivy League presidents have shared, their data suggests if there's one factor, one number that tells you, will this person graduate and be successful? It is those scores. GPA and grade inflation have rendered that metric unreliable. Colleges, they want the SAT and ACT. Someone is asking about worried about summer plans. I got good news. When you talk about scrambling and trying to find summer plans, I want you to keep in mind my students who do the best are often students who had summer plans, summer programs, internships, shadowing opportunities. Some of my strongest students are students who had those things fall through. A student of mine who is at Stanford had a really wonderful internship canceled because of COVID. We had a very brief conversation, and I told him, why don't you make or create something for other students rather than, you know, just not attending this thing that you were going to attend. Attending is here. Creating and building something for others is here. He took that and ran with it. And that is what Stanford mentioned in his acceptance letter. They mentioned the thing he had built and created for others because he had missed out on an opportunity that was canceled because of COVID. Someone's asking, is a 32 a good score on the ACT? Yes, it's a good score. I would say a 32 on the ACT is not as good as a 1520. Probably 1520 and about a 34 on the ACT would be more in concordance. Would you submit threes for an AP test? For many schools, I would. A 3 is a passing score, and for the UCs, you probably will get credit, although there's some changes in that policy. Will an Ivy school be excited, happy, pleased with threes on an AP test? No. But once you get outside of that Ivy League range, a 3 is meaningful. It means you get credit for a college class. Okay, someone's asking, this is a rather detailed question. Number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4 points, according to you, on the scale of importance to get into a top 20 engineering college, specifically Midwestern. Yeah. Number 1 is challenging classes that are consistent with engineering interests and doing well in them, having mostly A's. But you do not, unlike UCLA and Berkeley, you don't need to be all A's. A weighted class that you got to be in, a couple of them, is not a death sentence. Thank goodness for these schools. Second thing would be SAT, ACT scores. They're tremendously interested in these scores. I'd say third point would be having experiences in engineering or computer science outside of simply things that you signed up for in school, finding internships, finding other kinds of programs that allow you to do hands-on work. And the fourth thing, maybe this isn't last, maybe this would be higher on the list, would be creating opportunities for others. The first three things are answering this question: how good are you? But the fourth thing is, what good have you done with these things that you are good at? The higher up you go, the more that fourth thing, not just how good are you, but what good things have you done? That's a very important point indeed. Someone is asking that students from the same high school, are they evaluated in the same pool? Basically, yes. Basically, yes. Um, I mean, there's exceptions to everything, but as a basic notion, yes. Um, uh, you are. Someone is asking, do girls get a special quota in engineering colleges? They used to. I don't see being female as having the same impact it once had. And that's partly because if American universities didn't try to sort the gender imbalance, if they didn't try to sort it or force it to be more equitable, um, because teenage girls in almost every measurable way outperform boys, many American universities would be 70% female if admissions were not to consider those factors. Um, that is one reason why I'm probably not seeing the same advantages for girls. I would say girls who help other girls in what's sometimes called the leaky pipeline into leadership in STEM, that can be a very important factor. But I'd say the effective quotas in women in engineering programs is modest. For other more underrepresented groups, um, it's more apparent. Um, when I say happening to something and someone's asking, how do you communicate impact? Um, okay. Um, the student I was alluding to, who had a really good biophysics internship that was canceled because of COVID. I told him attending it would have taught you something about biophysics, but there's not a lot of impact. He had discovered something extraordinary about a deep space object called the Cat's Eye Nebula, and he earned a major international award for this accomplishment. But even that isn't the impact that I'm talking about. When I suggested that he create or build something for others in the summer, on his own, he went off and created a summer online space camp for kids, mostly who were underrepresented, not commonly found in the world of STEM and science and astronomy. And it was that impact, um, the fact that he brought something to the world. It was that Stanford mentioned in their acceptance letter. Um, it probably is getting close to too late for summer programs for high school juniors. But again, it is never too late to create or build something during the summer, and that will have a much more profound effect than attending something. Someone is asking, can you explain the need to declare your major during the admission application at UCs versus being able to change your major? Yeah, I'll do my best. Majors that are within the College of Letters and Science are far less what we call impacted than majors that are in a specialized college like architecture or art or nursing or in particular engineering, which often, although not always, contains computer science. You can get out of an impacted major at a special college within a university like UCLA into the College of Letters and Science fairly easily, but you can't go the other way. It's almost impossible to get into nursing or engineering unless you applied for that major. That's the essential meaning of impacted. Some majors within College of Letters and Science at a popular UC like UCLA are more popular than others, and they may require freshman GPA minimums to get in. And some programs at UC San Diego in computer science are suggesting they're going to use identity factors. They're going to use whether you're first gen or whether you're underrepresented. But in general, the College of Letters and Science contains majors that we sometimes call open, and indeed you're open to change your mind and try out. Now, at an Ivy League school, even Yale, Harvard, computer science will tend to be an open major, whereas at UC San Diego and UCLA, computer science is never an open major. So it's a little more complicated, maybe, um, than a simple binary impacted, not impacted, but you can change your major pretty easily to from an open to another open major at most UCs. It's very difficult, approaching impossible, to change it into an impacted major. Um, um, we we work with high school juniors. Someone's asking this question in a number of ways. But generally we consider someone who's at least in the middle of the 11th grade, and now we're getting students who are near the end. We consider that to be in the service of helping them build their application to college. So with high school juniors, we think we've got 4 or 5 months to see if you can find some organic, real instance of impact. I had a student who's now at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. She graduated from Stanford a year and a half ago or a year ago. She's amazing. In May of 11th grade, the day she finished her 11th grade year, we sat down for the first time, and I simply said, you need to find some project that would get Stanford's attention. And it was her mom, her brilliant mom, that said, she's been talking about this thing she wants to build, make, do. I'm going to see if she can do that. When I'm working with juniors in late spring, I'm trying to figure out, is there a piece that they could organically, naturally be excited about making or building that would really um, make a college application complete? Um, Someone's asking about public Ivies. What do I mean? It's a fuzzy term. People are using this term more and more to acknowledge that the Ivy League is technically a group of 8 universities that play football against each other. MIT, Stanford, not technically Ivy League. And when we ask, well, what about engineering? What about computer science? And we see that Yale is like 37 in the rank of engineering and computer science programs. And we see that Michigan is number 5, or University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign is number 5. We see that Purdue is number 7 or 8 in engineering, ranked above Princeton and Cornell, which are the top Ivies. Those are the kinds of institutions that I mean when I'm talking about public Ivies. Um, Someone says, if your AP score is lower than a 5, should I not submit it? It depends on the type of college we're talking about. I would say, in general, I'd submit 4s and 5s. For Ivy Leagues, 5s would be best. For the UCs, I'd submit every passing AP score. All right, someone's asking for Big Ten schools, other public schools, in the top 50, 60, what SAT score would he need? I don't think there's a score where you get that, you're in automatically, but I would say you might have a slightly distorted sense of what a good score is. In San Diego, where there are a lot of good schools, very competitive students, people sometimes think a 1200 or 1300 SAT score is not a good score, an embarrassingly low score. It is not an embarrassingly low score. Those scores would be often in the top 10% of scores in the nation. And so I would say scores in the 1200s and 1300s will be considered pretty positively by many of these top 50 schools in the Midwest. And you bump into the 1400s, now you are likely going to get a merit scholarship from these schools. So 1400 level score would be fantastic for many of these schools. 1200 and 1300 would be helpful. All right, someone's asking, if my student goes to CCA and gets a couple Bs in AP classes, should they not hope for decent UCs? No, I wouldn't say they should give up all hope. It's not Dante's Inferno, but you should be aware, even if your student goes to CCA and has no Bs, the acceptance rate for UC San Diego for CCA students was around 13%. So um, it'll be tough not having perfect or nearly perfect grades. But even if you have perfect grades, um, the UCs just don't want so many students from CCA, from Westview, from Del Norte. I would say I had some students this year who got into every UC to which they applied. Um, there's always hope. Um, my point is the UCs are not predictable. They're very arbitrary. Um, when people get into Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, MIT, do not get into the UCs. That's what I mean by arbitrary. So, um, someone is asking, someone says, if you get a 1580, is that high enough not to take the test again? Absolutely. I would say once you get into the 550 or higher, you're probably done. A 1580, I can think of 100 things that would be a better use of your time than to take the SAT again if you got a 1580. I hope if someone gets a 1580, instead of telling a student they should take it again, I hope you take that kid out to dinner. Um, are letters of recommendation important? Yes, they are. They're very important. Keep in mind the UCs don't want letters of rec. They don't want test scores. The UCs, I'm sorry, the Cal States don't even want essays. The more colleges want to know about you, if you're a strong applicant, the better you're going to do. Letters of recommendation are important. I would have people consider letters of recommendation are going to speak to who you are as a person and how pleasant you are, how charming you are. Students should keep that in mind. Um, um, do you have advice for non-Ivy level students? Yes. I would say for many competitive majors, non-Ivy schools are better than Ivies. And I would be happy at any point to talk about the hundreds of fantastic schools that are not Ivy level, but we look at where the graduates end up. They end up running the country. They end up as surgeons. They end up as CEOs. Um, I love those schools. Um, should you submit both SAT and ACT if one is better than the other? It really depends. I need to look at that on a case-by-case basis. Class rank is not tremendously important. Someone's asking about that. Um, for an Ivy League, it's helpful if we can plausibly see you as maybe in the top 10 in your class. I think I've already tried to define as much as I can what I mean by public Ivies. Absolutely. Someone's asking if they can have a meeting. Send a message to info, send a message to me. We'll make sure that that happens at your earliest convenience. Um, uh, someone's asking, good question. Is it easier to get accepted at a UC for majors like business, econ, or political science? Business is not offered as a major at most UCs. It's not a major at UCLA. It's not a major at many of the UCs. And where it is offered, it's an impacted major. It's a harder major to get into. But econ and poli-sci, yes, it would be easier than anything that is engineering or anything that is computer science. Um, no, it is not too late to start working with us. In fact, in the old days, this would be early. Um, Okay, someone is asking, 13% of CCA students get into UC San Diego in 2023. Is it higher or lower for Francis Parker Bishops? You should be able to go into that common data set that I put in a slide, and you can put in any parameters you want, and you can look up all of that. Um, uh, I see someone says the student was asking if they should retake a 1580. Again, no, you should take them out to dinner. Their favorite restaurant. Letters of rec have a bunch of different questions that they're asking. But here's the most important one. We can see from grades and scores whether we're talking about an amazing student. The letter of recs are typically about a different question. Is this an amazing human being? The kids who are the smiliest, the happiest, the kids that make teachers happy that they chose to do something involving public service, those kids do well in letters of rec. And I would say letters of rec probably one of the more important elements in terms of how did that kid get into, fancy schmancy schools like Stanford or Harvard. Generally, the happiest, funniest, most pleasant human beings do better, all other things considered. I want to thank everyone um, for your time. Thank you for graciously sharing some of it with us. Thank you for your questions. I'll be happy to answer others that you feel haven't been given their proper due. Thank you, Winnie, for helping with the presentation with the webinar. And I hope everyone has a wonderful evening and all best. Thank you.